Hi, I'm Bertha Tillman.
And I'm Eric Scott. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Every February, the Levine Museum of the New South joins the nation in celebration, remembrance, and reflection during Black History Month.
But we also ensure that Black history is part of our programming year-round.
Today, we'd like to share with you some of our favorite moments, from conversations with Danny Glover and Bakari Sellers,
to music from Destiny Stone and Mary D. Williams.
We hope you enjoy these highlights from our past year.
One of the first terms that I learned when I started playing these drums in the djembe orchestra was the jelly. The jelly, the African storyteller. And I learned how important that role was and is in the African culture. The storyteller keeps the history alive. The jelly goes back in the past, like Sankofa, that term from the Akans in Ghana, West Africa. Sankofa, we go back into the past to retrieve the jewels of the past, bring them to the present so that we know where we're going. We must always tell the stories so that our next generation will be sensitive. They will be understanding of the journey that got us to where we are today, to help the next generation know how to move forward. The oral history is so important. The jelly, you know, I have plenty of jelly friends who play their instruments, sing their songs. It's so beautiful and enchanting, but they're doing such an important work to keep the old ancient stories and history alive. Let's not forget our history. Let's give thanks to all throughout the diaspora that continue to tell the history, to tell our journeys. All of us need to find the elders in our family, the oldest member of our family, and we need to interview them. We need to document their story so that the richness and the legacy of our family, community, and the globe, we don't lose it. Our elders are the walking libraries. Let's not lose those treasures and gems. Let's document these stories from the elders. The oral tradition, the jelly, Juneteenth. Let's celebrate the history.
Kaya mae, kaya. Kaya mae, kaya. Kaya mae, kaya. Kaya mae, kaya. Kaya. Olepo. Kaya. Oleko. Kaya. Olepa. Kaya.
The first time I met Patrick and his lovely wife was they had donated their Romare Bearden's collection to my son's school so that young people could learn about this wonderful African-American artist. And it was such a generous donation, and my son and his young friends got so much out of it. And so when I say that you have, this is a passion and then you've really given back to the community, I'm not exaggerating. So I think my first question for you, Patrick, is why did you write this book?
Kim, I can't thank you enough for your willingness to arrange this interview this morning. Again, I thank you and the Levine Museum of the New South for this opportunity. My grandmother was the inspiration for this book, Kema. As a child, when I'd visit her in her Augusta, Georgia home, I was absolutely mesmerized by the artwork and the family photographs that she displayed throughout her home. So basically, I inherited my interest in African American art and culture as a direct result of the influence of my grandmother.
Wow, that's interesting. And so tell us, you know, it's not just that you collect, but it's been really important to you and your wife that you educate the community, that you share with the community. You've gifted me pieces of art, and now you're gifting all of us with this chronicle of your passion. Why is that important to you?
Well, it's important because we have been very, very fortunate. Judy and I have had the extraordinary opportunity of meeting some of the most important African-American artists of the 20th century. It includes, artists like Romare Bearden, Elizabeth Catlett, Richard Hunt, and others. And they welcomed us into their lives. Again, we were able to form friendships with many of the artists that we collect. And again, it's just been a tremendous journey that has inspired us in lots and lots of ways. And one of the ways in which I wanted to share this was through this a memoir.
I love that. And it is really important. Like I said in the beginning, we might be a history museum, but art does chronicle history for generations. And it's really important what you and Judy have done to make sure that you are collecting, but not just for your own personal enjoyment, but you share that history and you honor African-American artists. And I think people are really beginning to understand the import of collecting different cultures and understanding the import different cultures have on us as a country. And so what would you say to the young collector who, has an interest in maybe it's Native American art or Asian art or something? How do they begin collecting?
That's a great question, Kema. In fact, at the end of the book, I list out about 14 or 15, just tidbits of advice for beginning collectors. The very first piece of advice that I would offer a beginning collector would be only to buy artwork that you like, that appeals to you, that a new collector should not be too overly influenced by friends or other collectors, but only purchase items that the individual would like to have in their home and live with that art on an ongoing basis.
I say, wait a minute now, you got to put on a mask now. Right. Have a mask now. I was handing out masks in Rennes, Georgia last week. You know what I'm saying? Right. You got his mask and you put on the mask. I'm cuz, yeah, but you young cuz.
So those are the kind of films like The Color Purple explores a little bit of Georgia and sort of. So I guess the thing that I'm really getting at is why you choose the movies that you choose or that you have chosen, and are you still seeking to tell these kinds of stories?
I think, Brother Griffin, the movies choose me. I mean, I try to say in the movie that I come in at a point in time that those movies are done.
Okay.
There are other movies that have done. I mean, I did Silverado,
right.
Which was this whole moment where you have a Western with a black hero in it,
right.
And we've seen Westerns with white heroes, but we see this Western. And something happened to me. I'll tell you a story. I'm walking in San Francisco down the street, and in a community that the Fillmore, and about 3 young men walk up to me and say, "Hey, man," and I've done Places in the Heart. You may have seen that or whatever. He said, "Man, we just saw you in this Western." Yeah, man, you the guy in the Western. I said, "Yeah." He said, "You know what we liked about it? You knew how to take care of yourself." You know what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's important.
The same thing. That in a different way to the different generation of young people who saw Black Panther.
Right.
So, you know how to take care of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the theme of that whole idea, the simplicity of that, of watching a movie where you understand, you don't understand the bigness, the largest, the bigness of the movie, the fact that it takes over the screen and everything else. And then you see someone that looks like you, who's able to do the things that happen in Black Panther, or things that happen in Silverado, and that means something in a sense. So in all that sense, and to be able to kind of, grandmother saw Color Purple, and she said, "I'm gonna get a switch after that boy." He was raised better than act like that. And
Right.
grandmother that a switch would just materialize in her hand. Where did she find that?
Right.
Where did she
Get it in a pocketbook, right?
Right.
Right.
They're all over the house. You know about that. Your mom and daddy know about those kind of
Of course. So years ago, and this is a sort of a follow-up to that. Years ago, while I was in grad school, I read somewhere that you had interest in bringing the story of the 761st Black Panther Tank Battalion to the screen. I was wondering, how did you find out about that story? And this is a shameless inquiry because it's something that I have an interest in as well. The person who wrote "Come Out Fighting," Tresvant Anderson, happens to be from Charlotte, and I am writing a biography of him, completing a biography of him right now that'll be out later next year. But how did you find out about that? Because it's not a story that's widely known, but it is a story that I think Americans really need to hear about.
Absolutely, because I mean, those stories, those stories are available to us, and it's decided you want to find out those stories because I heard about it, and even though it was a script, the whole idea of doing the story and being engaged in the story is a step in that of claiming ownership of the story. We have to claim ownership of the story, and so it becomes that became something that those wish lists. You have to get this wish list, and you're attached to it. Somebody said, "Man." And this is when we think we can do everything, but we have to think we can do everything in order to do some things,
Right.
And you have to think you can do everything and tell every story, because it allows you the breadth and the intent to not just stop there.
Okay.
They're not to say, yes, there are great stories, I mean, there are great stories, there's great stories. And if I start naming those stories, I'm going to be remiss in some way because I didn't think of all the ones that are really there. We have an opportunity to tell. They have to be a part of our thinking. And also, I think one of the things that I think about, where is where's the connection? Finding the connection through all those stories, lending that breadth and the continuum that has happened that we're all a part of, and in the 20th century, the stories that happened during Reconstruction. I remember someone came to me a story about Railroad Bill, Robin Hood, and he was doing the populist movement, and the movement where white and black citizens, poor citizens, came together to fight the powers that be at the time. Those are those stories. Those stories lie within the framework we have to understand. Baldwin also said, when we cannot tell ourselves the truth about the past, we become trapped in it.
Of course.
We become trapped in it. You have the governor of Texas saying the Civil War was not about slavery. The Civil War was about states' rights. Come on.
Right.
Come on.
That's only one aspect of the narrative, right? Yeah.
You had 4 million citizens who built the wealth of this country. 4 million people. They weren't even citizens. They were not citizens.
Right.
Built the wealth of this country. Brought this poor country at the time of its independence and its Revolutionary War into the most powerful country economically in the world by the 1840s. And because at one point in time, the value of slaves were more than the gross national product of the country. The value of slaves.
Yeah. Well, that's what I mean. We talked a little bit before we got online, and again, this is one of the reasons why I really appreciate you, because you are a student of history, and I love that about you. And one of the sayings that's been said thus far in the program, that Levine, we use history to build community. And And a lot of people, you know, really don't know that about you until they sit down and talk to you. More pointedly, you know, John Henry Clark once said that history is the clock that people use to tell our political and cultural time of the day. Where do we find ourselves in the timeline of history today? Reverend Barber talked about it being we're in the third phase of Reconstruction.
Thank you.
Where do we? What's your opinion about where we find ourselves?
Well, I think where we find ourselves, and I thought the crucible for this experiment of democracy, which we call American, it runs through those formerly enslaved Africans. It cannot be what it should be and can be, must be, unless justice is brought to those formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants, period. That's what it is. Basically, it is that. So when we talk about that, and we've always been that, we've always symbolized that particular moment. So understanding the history that we've made, understanding the extraordinary history that we've made, wherever we were, whatever time it was, whatever moment it was, it's important to understand that, but understanding more than the link, the link between all that history. Back during the colonial wars in Portugal against the Portuguese Empire, in Mozambique with Frelimo, or in Angola or in Guinea-Bissau, they've always used the expression "a luta continuum." It's Portuguese for the struggle continues. The struggle continues.
Right.
We're always kind of willing to think about, yes, we have on our plate the idea that we even thought of maybe reparations. What does that mean in terms of mass incarceration? What does that mean in terms of education? When I'm thinking about it, what does it mean in terms of building communities? And what does it mean by building meaningful jobs, creating meaningful jobs, teachers and other jobs where we bring in people and really nourish people's mind and nourish their imagination? When I think about reparations, that's what it is.
Yeah, you and I on the same wavelength.
Rise forward. I have lived to see it with mine own eyes, the rise of my people, the awakening of our spirit, the dawn of a new day. I can feel it with every bone in my existence. Our ancestors whisper and move, forge forward, push harder, run faster, go that way. I can feel it with every inch of my existence, the tides rising, our love for self re-emerging. I see us reaching for the lessons of old, holding on to the stories that we've been told, building together, growing together, getting on track, getting on purpose. I can see it with my own eyes, our great-great-great-grandparents' prayers being answered, the fruits of their labor, the seed bursting up from beneath the soil. They planted the trees, hoping that in some generation, that shade that came as a result will push their grandchildren forward. I feel our shoulders broadening, finally gaining strength enough to hold on, steady enough to carry our own history, thick enough to reach down, pull our little brothers and sisters up to say, hold on to my grasp because you're coming along with me. This time is our time, this moment. Everything else has led us to here. All of the sacrifices deeply entrenched in our existence, all of the rich royal fortitude flowing within our blood. This time is the right time. It's every single thing that our ancestors dreamed of. Our crowns have been bought and paid for. Our investment has matriculated for over 400 years. It was through the forced sacrifice of every single thing tied to our history and culture. It has been sealed and delivered in every generation's blood, sweat, and tears. This earth, it's our inheritance. We are standing on sacred land. We hold on to the hands that built this, the minds that created this. And if anyone is equipped to change this with the courage and will to create and wisdom to understand that it will take the elevation of our consciousness, collective unity, the desire to grow and build, invest and divest, structure and restructure, take back our children take hold of our communities, I see it forming with my own eyes. The new Africa that was at the forefront of my father's dreams. They knew that they might not get to the promised land with us, but it didn't stop them from working to provide us with all of the courage and will to survive that we might need. I feel it with the swelling of the ocean, the trembling of the sea. We are shaking things up. I can see it in the brown faces beaming with pride. We are reaching deep into our history and redefining Black love. This time, right now, has been perfectly crafted for us to pull from every ounce of fight that we have left on the inside. Our intrinsic nature, our will to survive, the pen has been lifted and the ink has been dried. We can live the rest of our lives as royalty, standing in confidence in front of the world, taking our proper place. Let them throw every single thing that they can at us and not be burdened down by its weight. We are properly prepared for glory, the direct descendants of kings and queens, the great-great-great-grandchildren of those who were enslaved. It's time to cash in that check that our ancestors paid so we can plant trees for future generations. And when they get to the place where they need to benefit from the shade, we will whisper into their essence, forge forward, push harder, run faster, my child, go that way. That poem gets me a little bit emotional, but it's a piece that I wrote to remind me of our history and of my unique responsibility to continue to speak our stories in the most beautiful and responsible ways possible. You get that charge as well to speak your stories, to own your history, the good parts and the bad parts of it. And that's how we change the world, you know?
Because we are in the South, the relationship between African Americans and law enforcement has always been one of contention. Historically, law enforcement in North Carolina and the Charlotte region has always been a way to restrict African Americans' activities and control their labor. The modern police department traces its formal origins back to the post-Civil War period, when surprisingly, the city's police force consisted of both Black and white police officers. This experiment did not last long, however, because of the restrictions placed upon African American officers, which prevented them from detaining or arresting whites who violated crimes. The presence of African Americans on the police force lasted until 1868, when a white former Confederate soldier was killed by a black police officer named John T. Schenck. Not until 1940 would blacks serve on the police force again. Yet they would still have to fight for the right to police white civilians who broke laws. In the period between Reconstruction, the end of Reconstruction, and the turn of the 20th century, the relationship between police and the Black community became increasingly strained. Now, this was largely due to the growth of convict leasing, or what some people refer to as the chain gang system. Mecklenburg County became the first in the state to have a permanent chain gang in 1885. Majority Black convicts built and repaired roads. The state prisons and convict camps were run by former Confederate officers like Captain W.T. Laughinghouse, who was the superintendent of the state prison in 1910s. Laughinghouse wrote that the pool of potential Black convicts are young, strong, able-bodied men. The criminal courts try between 25 to 30 men in Charlotte for crimes every term. And every strong, able-bodied man whose sentence is less than 10 years is sent to the public roads of the county. Charlotte Mayor Charles Bland wrote that he believed that the good roads which had been constructed in the county have been one of the greatest factors in building up the city. Quote, "I believe good roads are an earmark of civilizations," he stated. As more and more state officials came to adopt these kinds of beliefs, North Carolina moved to consolidate the State Highway Commission and the State Department of Prisons. By the 1920s, convict leasing had become such an important part of the local labor force, so much so that police harassment had become commonplace in the Black community. Because of this policy of over-policing in the Black communities, there were often violent clashes between African Americans and police. white police officers often found themselves in precarious situations. There were at least two such cases in the 1920s, one in 1924 and another in 1929. It had become customary that if a black man killed a white police officer, he could expect a death sentence. But the incident in 1929, when Clyde Fowler shot and killed Officer Edgar Corral, who had entered his residence in the middle of the night without identifying himself, it was different. Black Charlotteans this time were fed up with having officers burst into their homes unannounced and sought assistance from the NAACP, and they made their dissatisfaction known to public officials. This was the first instance in which we see local African Americans organize against the policy of over-policing in their communities. The NAACP hired a lawyer who argued that the officer broke protocol for not reading a warrant before he entered Fowler's home. And the officer also had a history of killing black suspects. Now, this argument did not get Fowler acquitted. Instead, the jury convicted him of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 20 years in jail. But it marked the first time in North Carolina history that a black man accused of killing a white police officer was not sentenced to death. By the mid-1930s, convict leasing came to an end in Mecklenburg County after the national NAACP instigated an investigation that exposed inhumane conditions and treatment in convict laborers' camps. Despite these earlier victories, and even with the eventual hiring of black police officers in the 1940s, Charlotte's black community continues to struggle with law enforcement tendencies to over-police their communities and view African Americans in general as potential dangerous threats to justify the lethal force. Yet these early instances of African Americans organizing around over-policing is an important in light of the emergence of Black Lives Matter movement in more recent years, because it lets us know that policing has always been an issue in the Black community. It is not a recent phenomenon that emerged with social media. In the past, the purpose for over-policing tactics served to fill a local labor need. Today, these tactics serve as a political tool that allow politicians to boisterously call for over-policing as a way to show their potential constituents that they value law and order and are tough on crime.
Despite Minneapolis's longstanding reputation for liberalism, both history and recent events suggest a much more complicated and troubling experience for many residents of the city. And of course, the rest of the nation got to see that in May and June of this year, 2020. But the events around the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police earlier this year have a more deeply rooted history. There's a history here in Minneapolis of a correlation between race and impoverishment. This is something that has been here in Minneapolis for a long time, and policing, in particular racialized policing, has also been a significant and powerful experience shaping the daily lived experiences of both African American and American Indian communities, as well as other communities of color in Minneapolis. And here in Minneapolis, racialized policing is in many ways sanctioned and supported by the city's police union, as is true in other cities across the United States. And the city's police union has long played an outsized role in Minneapolis politics. Now, that in and of itself has a long history. The police union started to become a political power in Minneapolis in the 1950s, but things weren't truly cemented in terms of the police union's place in city politics until the end of the 1960s. In 1969, the head of the police union in Minneapolis, a man named Charles Stenvig, was elected mayor of Minneapolis. And he ran on a law and order platform, one that was in many ways a reaction to uprisings from people of color in Minneapolis in 1966 and 1967, uprisings that themselves were not only the result of segregation in housing and segregation in employment, usually informal in some cases, in other cases formal through racial covenants when it came to residents, as well as police brutality. And the breakdown in community relations between the citizens of Minneapolis and the city's police had begun long before 1969. But when Charles Stenvig became mayor and ran on a platform in which he argued that the handcuffs should be taken off the police. A certain understanding of policing in Minneapolis was made concrete. In 1969, Minneapolis's largely white working class population voted to put Stenvig in office. In 1971, when Stenvig stood for re-election, he ran against Minneapolis's leading civil rights figure, a person named Harry Davis. Harry Davis had served on the school board. He served as the leader of many different civil rights organizations in town. And as an African-American man, he had grown up in the city. He had grown up in this majority white space and understood how the city worked. In fact, Harry Davis had the backing of the Democratic Party, the newspapers, many business people, as well as African-Americans and other people of color in the city. But in 1971, Minneapolis voters decided to keep Charles Stenvig in office and to keep ensuring that racialized policing would in fact define the daily experiences for people of color in the city. And that race in 1971, over 70% of Minneapolis voters decided to keep Stenvig in office. And the two key features of that 1971 mayoral campaign, in which Stenvig again ran as an independent, neither Democrat nor Republican, over 70%. The two defining issues were school desegregation and racialized policing. So the story of George Floyd in Minneapolis has a much longer trajectory, a much longer history, a much deeper history that's directly related to long-standing practices and the long-standing power of the police union backing racialized policing in the city of Minneapolis.
As such, now you have a relatively new organization, I think, but you won a major victory this summer already here with the Charlotte City Council. Can you talk about that and how you did it?
Oh, I guess you're talking about Charlotte for Black Futures.
Yes,
yes. And that was a coalition as a direct response to what we saw happening with George Floyd, right? And we've seen coalition happening as a direct response to killings before. So that wasn't a new movement per se, a new action, let me say it that way. However, but this one was a little bit more comprehensive because we had the key people that were out in the streets protesting for us to say, we support you and we're going to do our part and we're going to continue on and this is long term. So we had a lot of ands instead of the moments.
And when you move that into the city council meeting, what happened with the tear gas? I guess is what I'm wanting everybody to know about.
Oh, the tear gas. Well, now I wouldn't say that was a direct response from Charlotte for Black Futures, right?
They credit you. The news credits you with that.
They credit us? Okay, great. You'll find that I don't watch a lot of news either. But I think it's partly because when you see somebody like Christy, who not is only a comrade, but a friend, that is personal, right? So I think a lot of people don't want to recognize that it's personal.
Right.
To see and hear and have to talk about. So what we did was to be vigilant in gathering people, the usual suspects, the unusual suspects, and say, we are all here and we're saying the same thing. So whether you're going to the streets or you're going to a boardroom or you're going to someone whom you find respectable, we are all saying the same thing. And I think that's the difference that we haven't seen a lot in our movements.
Excellent, excellent. And so the audience knows they were able to get the city council to pass, I don't know, was it a resolution or what it was, but to defund the tear gas element of the police. So the police won't have tear gas this upcoming year to disperse upon protesters. So that's, I think that's huge. We're great. And it's also a great example for other cities that that you did that and how you got that done and what pressure was brought to bear. So I think you have even a city council member who's out with you guys and everything. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Braxton, yes.
Yes.
It's considered one of the most important pieces of civil rights legislation ever passed.
What the court did today is say it's outdated.
It was a total unawareness of the existence of prejudice in the United States.
We'd worked so hard, we'd struggled so long, people had lost their lives for this, and bam, it's taken away just like that.
We are sick and tired of being sick and tired.
If we're going to do anything that's worthwhile, we've got to go for the vote.
That's a revolutionary act in Mississippi.
They didn't like integration, they didn't like the vote, they didn't like niggas.
The voting was absolutely dangerous business.
That was the big fear of white folks, to vote.
They were fighting for their dear life, their way of life.
We are going to see to it that law and order is maintained, and maintained Mississippi style.
You could go missing, and no one would ever find you.
Republican was a synonym for Yankee. Republicans were the party of Lincoln.
As black voters were flocking in increasing numbers to the Democratic Party, white voters would flock in increasing numbers to the Republican Party.
Parties switched places.
They recognized that they could use race to win.
That's commonly called playing the race card.
Don't play the race card.
A new bill has been introduced in the North Carolina Senate requiring North Carolinians to present an ID when they go to vote.
These are not dumb Southerners wanting to get those black people.
It has nothing to do with race.
Of course it's race. How can you say it's anything else?
So we have marched, we have lobbied, we have advocated, we've gone to the hearings. We said, no, we have to go to the next level.
If you think we're going to allow any group of politicians to suppress the right to vote, you must be out of your doggone mind.
Mr. Trump has again repeated the unproven claim that millions of illegal votes were cast in the last election.
None of them come to me. They would all be for the other side.
Where is the evidence of that? The President of the United States is correct 100%.
There's nothing to do with voter fraud. Nothing to do with voter fraud.
Do we have to fight these battles all over again?
So, Gavin, how does a guy who makes dinosaurs kind of run across your screen end up making a film about voting rights?
Well, I'll keep it short, but it started with a book that I picked up to read on an airplane. Pulitzer Prize winning book by a man who's in the film, was in that trailer, named Taylor Branch, called Parting the Waters. And that is the first of a trilogy on the civil rights movement that kind of made my head explode, because I didn't know so much of this, right? I mean, as a kid growing up in the 70s, which is not that far removed from the civil rights movement. It was very much distilled to Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, the March on Washington, and then on to Vietnam. I mean, there really wasn't a lot there. I knew a lot of the characters as their later in life personas, like John Lewis was a congressman, Marion Barry was a mayor, Andrew Young was an ambassador and a mayor, but I didn't know where they got their start. I didn't know how they cut their teeth in this movement. And so many other people who I just never heard of. The chief of them was Bob Moses, who struck me as enigmatic and eminently interesting, because he was the antithesis of what the stereotype of a civil rights leader is, right? He's not an orator. He doesn't get up and give speeches that are inspiring and you go, do your thing. Very quiet, very intellectual, very cerebral. He's very methodical and about getting the work done. And his whole story that was laid out in the book and sort of bringing the voting rights movement into Mississippi was so fascinating to me. And I kept trying to get my friends who make documentaries to do it, to make this movie about him. And they kept politely turning me down, but not for any reason other than they had their own projects to work on. And what you don't know if you don't make documentaries is that it's kind of an all-encompassing thing. It sort of takes over your life. So if you're working on a project and someone comes to you with another idea, you just like, yeah, you take it somewhere else, right? So I put it away. I didn't give it much thought until I lived in Astoria, Queens, New York City for many years. And there's this wonderful museum there called the Museum of the Moving Image, which is about, the moving image, television, film, what have you. They had an event where they got together several of the cast members from Roots, the miniseries, the Alex Haley miniseries on slavery. And I went and attended that, and Ben Vereen and LeVar Burton and Leslie Uggams and Lou Gossett Jr. were on stage. And this was in the winter of 2013, and Obama had just been sworn in for his second term. And I guess, certainly in liberal bubbles, there was this air of post-racialism, like it was this kind of strange feeling like, oh, well, that chapter is done. We can move on to something else. And these guys were having none of that, right? These actors were reminding us of what they went through just as actors, right? Never mind as just, normal people, who don't make a lot of money, but just the struggles that they went through in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And they went out of their way to say to the audience that was very middle class, NPR, PBS-y, audience members, museum goers, if you will. They said, look, if you think that this race thing is done, you're kind of deluding yourself. And then they challenged the audience right there. And I really felt strangely like they were talking to me. Like I was in a room full of people, but I felt strangely isolated. And they said, what are you doing to make the world more equitable and socially just today? And I didn't really have an answer, so I turned to my friend who I attended the thing with. I said, I'm going to make this movie about Bob Moses. To which he replied, who's Bob Moses, right? And I was like, well, there you go, right? So that was the impetus. I mean, this film was born out of that moment, right? Having said that, the film that you watched is not the film I set out to make. I mean, in a 6.5-year journey, it evolved quite a bit, right? So those of you who've seen the film, it's really Mississippi is Act 1 and is a proxy for the civil rights movement. So I didn't chase down every act of aggression or voting rights struggle in the civil rights movement. I used Mississippi to sort of tell that story of that time. And much like Willie said about North Carolina, I use North Carolina as a proxy for the country today, right? I didn't go to Indiana or Wisconsin or Alabama or Texas, like Florida. I could have gone all over the place, Georgia, but I really wanted to focus on, because they're all kind of the same story, right? It's just more of the same. So I really tried to bookend it as much as I could with Reverend Barber and the NAACP today and Bob Moses and SNCC then, and then connect the dots between those movements to kind of show, as you were saying in the intro, the historical context of how we got to where we are, because we often have these discussions without them, but there's no context to it.
wanted to ask Reagan Untitled if she had a favorite person or story that she encountered in all of this. And you're there we go.
I really like Sojourner Truth. I did not understand when I started how much the abolitionists and the suffragists were intertwined. And Sojourner Truth went around speaking about the evils of slavery and how important it was for women to be enfranchised. And she was born a slave and made her money by selling her pictures. She then realized other people were copying this, so she was the first person to copyright her own image in the United States. So she was born a slave, but died the first person to own her own image. And so I just thought, oh, you know, the entrepreneurship, what she went through. So I really admired her.
Today, we are used to the idea of large parades organized to promote social change, but the idea of suffragists marching publicly in the streets was at the time quite a radical proposal. Nevertheless, suffrage parades became a common and effective method of spreading the message in the second decade of the 20th century. When they returned to the U.S. from England, having learned the tactics of civil disobedience from the British militant suffragettes, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns also brought new life to the movement. Paul assumed the leadership of Nassau's congressional committee in charge of working toward a federal suffrage amendment. She and Burns organized the first national suffrage parade on March 3, 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson's presidential inauguration. To reinforce the notion of a universal demand for suffrage, women marched in well-identified groups by state or occupation, including teachers, lawyers, actresses, nurses, librarians, and factory workers. Between 5,000 and 8,000 suffragist supporters, 20 floats, 9 bands, and 4 mounted brigades marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in the show of force. College students and mothers, some marching with children and infants, had their own sections, as did men's groups who supported women's suffrage. Bands and floats were included, and participants wore white dresses with purple, gold, and white sashes. Known as the beautiful suffragist, Inez Mulholland was a labor lawyer and social activist. She became the face of the movement by leading the 1913 parade, riding a white horse and wearing a crown and cape. She carried a banner which read, "Forward to the Light." The 1913 parade was not without controversy. When they inquired about joining the parade, the Black women suffragists from Howard University's new Delta Sigma Theta sorority were not welcomed. Alice Paul quietly discouraged their participation, convinced that white women would not march with Black women. Nevertheless, 22 founding members, including Mary Church Terrell, joined the procession. They were told to march at the back of the parade, and they were not listed in the parade program. In 2013, a 100-year anniversary march was held in Washington, D.C., and the group intentionally chosen to lead the procession down Pennsylvania Avenue was Delta Sigma Theta. Ida B. Wells Barnett, the founder of the first Black women's club specifically focused on suffrage, the Alpha Suffrage Club of Chicago, traveled to D.C. to march in the 1913 parade. Wells Barnett was a prominent anti-lynching crusader, journalist, and suffragist. Upon arriving at the parade, she was immediately told as a woman of color to march in the back so as not to upset the Southern delegates. Wells Barnett insisted on marching with her state delegation, stating, "I either go with you or not at all. I am not taking this stand because I personally wish for recognition. I am doing it for the future benefit of my whole race." She waited until the parade began and then walked out from the side of the street to join her state delegation walking down between 2 white members. No one protested.
My father always taught us that the movement wouldn't have been anything without Fannie Lou, without Ella Baker.
Ella Baker. I named my daughter after Ella Baker.
so yeah, and so for me it was an easy jump to support a sister running, a Black woman running for president. Like, why would I not? Like, I didn't understand the reticence. I didn't understand. But at the end of the day, God orders our steps, and Senator Harris Kamala is where she needs to be and where she can do great work. And her smile is infectious. Her talent is unmatched. She's brilliant. My wife, Ellen, you like Kamala, don't you? Love her. My daughters. I mean, just think about October 7th, I think, is the debate day. I'm not sure. I think it's 7th. Like, my date's confused. October 7th, I think, is the debate day. But I mean, even yesterday, 2 days ago, you sitting in front of a TV with your daughters, and you have Black or brown daughters, and here's this amazingly strong, beautiful woman that walks out, and she's walking out beside Joe Biden, and she can be, she's going to be the woman who is the highest ranked elected official in the history of the United States. It's powerful.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, without a doubt.
While being stripped of their own children and youth. If these streets could speak, I'm sure they would tell of the horrors that they've seen. My people left with me. Oh, it's becoming reality. The things they dreamt of when they laid their heads to sleep, and they used to sing away in the water. Oh, in the water, children wade in the water. I know that God's gonna trouble the water. Little children wade in the water. And I'm singing wade. Trouble, yeah. And I know that God's gonna trouble, and I know that God's gonna trouble the water, the shoulders on which I stand. They are the shoulders of a Black woman and man.
So let not your heart be troubled. I sing because I'm happy. Oh, I sing because I'm free. Oh, his eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches. I know he watches. I know he watches
something that we've seen even in the churches. The men and women of words, the folks who get up there, the pastors who deliver a sermon, and the way that they communicate, the discourses that they use, the stories and the allegories that they use. This is all a part of our communication tradition. It's what it means to be African American. For any of y'all who've ever been in a black church setting, you know that a lot of times the preacher get to, singing and humming while they're talking. And, in addition to that, they engage in something called call and response. And so that means that the preacher may say something like, "Can I get an amen?" And the crowd is supposed to respond with the amen. Or if the preacher says God is good all the time, then the crowd responds. They know to respond by saying, "And all the time God is good." These are the things that characterize our patterns of speech. They are our rhetorical traditions, our communication styles, and they translate to our culture. But we get those from our ancestors, those folks who we have never met. And they're what make us African descended peoples. But you know what's even cooler than that is it's not just the way that we talk or the way that we interact or the music and the culture that we make as a result of those patterns. It's actually the way that we see things. So when you go back to the church and you think about the ways that black people, the ways that African Americans even read the Bible, the way that they interpret it has led to totally different traditions, some of which are called Black liberation theology traditions. And liberation meaning freedom, the struggle for freedom, and theology meaning the study of God, right? So when we talk about God and we read the Bible, a lot of times black people think about God differently. And that's because of what we've experienced through slavery, etc. So for African Americans, when we read, chapters in the book of Exodus, and we read about stories like Moses confronting Pharaoh, this big, powerful guy in Egypt, and demanding that he set my people free, let my people go. When we read that as African Americans, our ancestors read that and they said to themselves, "Well, now I may not know any Hebrews, but if this story is true, then it sounds to me like the God that they're talking about is on the side of the oppressed, is on the side of the enslaved, is on the side of the brutalized, and on the side of those who've been pushed away, those who've been cast aside, those who've been mistreated." And so we began to see ourselves in those stories. And it empowered a lot of us to be able to call for the abolition of slavery. And we began to tell ourselves that we believe God himself wanted black people to be free because he wanted the enslaved people in Egypt to be free as well. But beyond just the story of Moses and Pharaoh, when we even read about Jesus, Black liberation theology takes a totally different approach. And it comes from the tradition started by a man named Reverend Dr. James H. Cone. He's considered the father of Black liberation theology. And it was James Cone who first began to introduce the world to the idea that maybe Jesus was Black. And by saying Jesus was Black, he didn't necessarily mean that Jesus was of African descent or had brown skin, which maybe he did, right? That's quite possible. What he meant by saying that he was Black was that when you look at how black people are treated in the United States of America, that Jesus was like a black person, that he was born into a family that didn't have a whole lot of wealth or a whole lot of means or a lot of resources, that he belonged to an ethnic group that was mistreated, that he lived and grew up in the heart of Roman Empire, a big bad government who didn't treat people with respect, who often killed people, and that by challenging that authority is what ultimately got him crucified or hung out to dry, and in some cases lynched, right? That's one way to look at it, is that on one hand, you have the cross, you know, the two wooden sticks and being hung out to dry that way. And in America, African Americans were hung from trees, and for very similar reasons, right? As for why Jesus was crucified. And so there began to be parallels. We began to use theology and the black experience to look at things and look at the various parallels. And so our interpretation, the way that we even look at, and the lens that we look through to see the Bible, to understand God, is characterized by our blackness, is characterized by our experience as African Americans in the heart of empire, and in the heart of the most powerful nation on earth, oftentimes under the yoke of oppression, oftentimes being mistreated, belonging to a small ethnic minority. We begin to see Jesus through that lens, and that leads to what is known as a black liberation theology. Even in utero, I knew I was soon to flow. Lyric through umbilical, I spit it so that you would know the truth. Born with justice on my lips, and I'm quick to draw like a gun is on my hip. Modern day prophet, trumpet of truth up in this booth. Providing skeptics who haven't had enough with the proof, I will jump through the hoops of fire just for the youth. Entangled up in the web of lies, I'm cutting you loose. This for young and old alike. Because when I'm holding mics, it's the prototype for doing simply what you know is right. So I'ma hold the light. Better yet, the torch, marching through the thick of the forest and through the coldest nights. For better or worse, I let it disperse. And I commit myself to tell it till I'm dead in the hearse. And you could hear it in the words of each and every verse. So when I'm gone, on my headstone, let it be known I speak truth to the powers that be, as loud as can be. Make sure I'm heard, even if they ain't acknowledging me. So if you illiterate or got a college degree, I will fear no evil as long as God is in me. I speak truth to the powers that be, as loud as can be. Make sure I'm heard, even if they ain't acknowledging me. Whether you illiterate or got a college degree, I continue to speak the truth. This ain't hating. This is love at its greatest. And no one wants to say this. Don't care if I'm number one on your playlist. It's word, sound, power. The wretched of the earth screaming from a strong tower, beaming down sun showers, meaning that we illuminate and shine the rays, breaking through the storm clouds, attempting to change a gloomy fate. So either get on or get left. It's no pawns or missteps, or slide to the side, because I got moves to make. The tongue is ultra sharp. And if you know the art, you know that what we say pierces flesh and it goes for the heart. They let you live like a king long as you know your part. Make sure that you don't do a thing to try to show you're smart. The world is at your command, and before you let it slip, have some talcum powder on hand. I'm saying, get a grip. The time is now when I'm going to show you how to bring an empire to its knees. This is fire that I breathe.
We hope you enjoyed these programs and highlights from the past year.
And please stay connected as we honor, reflect, and celebrate Black history year-round.
Thank you for joining us for all of our Black history programming this month, including our story time. We look forward to seeing you soon as we start to celebrate Women's History Month with Her Story. See you soon.